Imagine a village in England, maybe 700 years ago. The houses are made of wood and mud. The streets are dirt paths. A baker is pulling bread from his oven. A farmer is leading his ox to a field. Life is slow. It follows the sun and the seasons. There are no police cars, there are no sirens. There is no 999 to call for help. So what happens when someone breaks the law? A man runs out of a small house, clutching a silver cup. The woman who lives there runs after him. She points and screams, "Stop him, thief!" That scream is the start of it. That is the whoo. It's a loud shout and alarm. It tells everyone within earshot that something is wrong. And then comes the cry. It's the sound of the whole community responding. The baker drops his bread. The farmer leaves his ox. Men and women pour out of their homes and workshops. They start shouting too. They join the chase. This wasn't a choice. It was a duty. This entire process, from the first shout to the final pursuit, was called the Hue and Cry. It was the original neighborhood watch, but it was much more raw. It was a system of justice based on sound and speed. The idea was simple. A criminal can't outrun an entire village. The chase would spill from one street to the next. As the suspect ran towards the edge of the village, the noise would travel with him. People working in the fields would hear it. They would look up, see the running mob, and know their duty. They had to join the chase, to head off the suspect, to block his path. The hue and cry was a hue and alarm system. It turned every citizen into a temporary police officer. The tools of the trade were not handcuffs and radios, but loud voices, strong legs, and a sense of shared responsibility. If someone raised the hue and cry, you had to respond. It didn't matter if you were busy. It didn't matter if you were tired. The law of the land said you had to run. The chase would continue from one village to the next. The group of pursuers would pass the responsibility to the next community in the path of the fleeing criminal. They would take up the shout, and their people would join the chase. A suspect could be pursued for miles, with a fresh wave of people taking over the pursuit in each new territory. The goal was to run the person to the ground, to catch them before they could find a place to hide. Once caught, the suspect was not immediately thrown in a modern jail. They would be held, often in a local church tower or a small village lockup. Then they would be brought before the local sheriff or justice. The evidence was the act of being caught. The witnesses were the entire village who had chased him. Justice was swift because the community had been the instrument of capture. This system might seem chaotic to us now. A mob of people chasing a single person through the countryside. But it was born of necessity. In a world without a professional police force, law and order was a do-it-yourself project. It relied on a powerful social contract. We protect each other because we are all in this together. If I help you catch the man who stole your cup today, you will help me catch the man who steals my goat tomorrow. The hue and cry was more than just a method of catching criminals. It was a constant reminder of how society worked. It stitched people together. Your neighbor's problem was your problem. The safety of the village was everyone's job. The sound of that first shout was a call to action. It was the sound of a community defending itself. It was the sound of justice on the run. And for centuries, it was the only sound that mattered when the law was broken. The hue and cry was not just a good idea or a local custom, it was the law. It was a legal duty deeply embedded in the English system for centuries. To understand it, you have to go back before the Norman conquest of 1066 to the time of the Anglo-Saxons. They had a system for keeping the peace that was all about collective responsibility. Society was organized into small groups. The basic unit was the tithing. A tithing was a group of 10 households. The men in these households were bound together by an oath. They were responsible for each other's behavior. If one man in the tithing committed a crime, the other 9 were responsible for bringing him to justice. If they failed, they were all punished, usually with a fine. It was a system of mutual policing. You watched your neighbor because his actions could cost you money. These tithings were then grouped into a larger unit called a hundred, which was roughly 100 households. The hundred had its own court and was responsible for maintaining order in its territory. So if a crime happened, the entire hundred was on the hook. This created immense social pressure to behave and to help enforce the law. The hue and cry was the practical tool that made this system work. It was the method by which the tithing or the hundred could be mobilized to catch a wrongdoer. After the Normans conquered England, they kept many of these Anglo-Saxon systems in place. They were practical and effective, but they also began to formalize them. The kings wanted a more standardized way of keeping the peace across the entire realm. The most important step in this process was the Statute of Winchester, passed in 1285 under King Edward I. This was a major piece of legislation. It wasn't creating something new, it was taking the old customs of the hue and cry and other duties and writing them down as the official law for all of England. The statute made it very clear what was expected of every able-bodied man. First, it explicitly commanded that the hue and cry be raised for any felony, and it stated that everyone who heard the cry must follow with the hue and cry with the country. They had to pursue the offender from town to town until they were caught. If they failed to do so, the entire hundred where the crime occurred could be fined. This put the financial burden on the whole community, making sure everyone had a stake in the outcome. Your laziness could cost your neighbors. Second, the Statute of Winchester established a watch and ward. In every walled town, the gates were to be closed from sunset to sunrise. A watch of men was to be posted at each gate all night. If any stranger tried to enter, the watch was to arrest them and hold them until morning. If the stranger resisted, the watch would raise the hue and cry. This was an urban version of the same principle, a way of securing towns during the most dangerous hours. Third, the statute included the assize of arms. This required every free man between the ages of 15 and 60 to own weapons and armor. The type of weapon depended on your wealth. A poor man might only need a bow and arrows. A wealthier man would need a sword, a helmet, and a coat of mail. These were not for fighting in the king's army. These weapons were for keeping the peace. When the hue and cry was raised, you were expected to grab your weapon and join the pursuit. You were, in effect, a part-time, unpaid, legally required militia member. This legal framework created a system where the state's power to enforce the law was distributed among the people. The sheriff was the king's chief law enforcement officer in a county, but he couldn't be everywhere at once. He had the power to call upon the post comitatus, a Latin term meaning the power of the county. This was the hue and cry on a grand scale. If a sheriff was facing a powerful outlaw or a large group of rioters, he could summon every able-bodied man in the county to help him. To refuse the sheriff's summons was a serious crime, so the hue and cry was not a spontaneous mob. It was a legal institution. It was the first line of defense in a society with very little official infrastructure. The law was simple and direct. See a crime, shout. Hear a shout, run. Fail to do either, and you and all your neighbors would pay the price. It was a harsh system, but it was built on a clear logic. The king's peace was everyone's responsibility. The law of the land was not just something written in a book, it was something you had to be ready to enforce with your own voice and your own feet. The law was clear, the theory was sound, but the reality of the hue and cry was often messy, chaotic, and far from perfect. It was a system run by ordinary people, with all their flaws and limitations. Putting it into practice was much harder than writing it down as a statute. One of the biggest problems was the risk of a false alarm. The whole system was triggered by a single person shout. What if that person was mistaken? What if they thought they saw a thief, but it was just a neighbor borrowing a tool without asking? Or what if the shout was malicious? A person could raise the hue and cry to settle a personal grudge. Imagine a farmer who hated his neighbor. He could accuse him of theft, raise the cry, and watch as the entire village chased an innocent man across the fields. Once the chase began, confusion was guaranteed. There was no one in charge. There was no chain of command. It was just a crowd of angry, excited people running after someone. Mistaken identity was a huge danger. The suspect might duck into an alley. The pursuers might come out the other side and grab the first person they saw who looked flustered or was running. An innocent traveler could easily be mistaken for a fleeing felon. The mob was not a detective force. It was a blunt instrument. The system also demanded a lot from people. A blacksmith would have to drop his tools, leaving hot iron to cool and ruin. A farmer might have to abandon his plowing in the middle of a crucial season. A merchant would have to leave his shop unattended. There was a real economic cost to this civic duty, and while the law demanded participation, human nature often got in the way. Some people would surely pretend they didn't hear the shout. Others might join the chase, but not run very fast. It was an interruption to their lives, and a dangerous one at that. The chase itself was a perilous activity. The terrain was rough. People could be injured, tripping in a ditch or falling on a rocky path. The suspect might be armed and desperate. Confronting a cornered criminal was not a job for the faint of heart. While men were required to have weapons, not everyone was a skilled fighter. A farmer with a pitchfork was not an equal match for a determined outlaw with a sword. And the system had its limits. It worked best in small, tight-knit rural communities where everyone knew each other. In such a place, a stranger stood out. If a crime was committed, the list of local suspects was short. The community was motivated to act because the victim was a neighbor, a friend, a cousin. But as towns and cities grew, the hue and cry became less effective. A city like London was full of strangers. Anonymity was a criminal's best friend. A thief could steal a purse, melt into a crowd, and be gone. Raising the hue and cry in a crowded market square would just create chaos. Who was the thief? Which way did he go? The bonds of community were weaker in a city. You might not know the person shouting for help. You might not feel the same obligation to risk your neck for a stranger. There are records from the time that show the system's weaknesses. Our courts frequently had to fine entire villages or hundreds for failing to pursue a criminal. This suggests that people were not always as diligent as the law required. Sometimes a community might even protect one of its own. If the local poacher, who was otherwise a decent fellow, was caught, the village might not be too enthusiastic about chasing him down. The hue and cry was a system based on an ideal of total community participation. But in practice, it was often a story of confusion, false accusations, and reluctant participants. It was better than nothing. In the absence of a police force, it provided at least some chance of catching a criminal. But it was far from a reliable or fair system of justice. It was a reflection of its time, a rough and ready solution for a rough and ready world. The shadows they were chasing were not always the right ones. For centuries, the hue and cry was the bedrock of English law enforcement. But societies changed. Villages grew into towns, and towns grew into sprawling, anonymous cities. The world that had created the hue and cry began to disappear, and the system itself started to become obsolete. Its decline was slow, a gradual fading away rather than a sudden end. The biggest factor in its decline was urbanization. The hue and cry was designed for a rural landscape of small, self-contained communities. It relied on people knowing their neighbors and feeling a sense of shared destiny. When a family moved to a crowded London slum in the 18th century, that feeling was lost. They lived surrounded by thousands of people they did not know. The social glue that held the system together had dissolved. If someone shouted, "Stop thief," in a busy city street, most people would just turn to look, not join the chase. It was no longer their problem. The nature of crime also changed. A simple thief was one thing, but organized gangs of criminals, highwaymen, and rioters were another. A group of untrained villagers with farm tools was no match for a coordinated gang of armed professionals. The amateur, community-based system was simply outgunned. Society was becoming more complex, and it needed a more professional response to crime. The idea of professional policing began to emerge. It was a slow process. In the mid-18th century, the author and magistrate Henry Fielding established the Bow Street Runners in London. They are often considered London's first professional police force. They were not a police force in the modern sense. They were a small group of paid constables who would investigate crimes and arrest offenders. They were more like detectives for hire, but they represented a crucial shift in thinking that catching criminals should be a job for dedicated, trained individuals, not a duty for the entire population. The real turning point came in 1829. The Home Secretary, Sir Robert Peel, pushed the Metropolitan Police Act through Parliament. This act created the London Metropolitan Police, the first modern, professional, and centralized police force in the world. Its officers were carefully selected, trained, and paid a regular salary. They wore a distinctive blue uniform to be easily identified. They were organized with a clear command structure. Londoners soon nicknamed them Peelers or Bobbies after their founder. The creation of the Bobbies fundamentally changed the nature of law enforcement. For the first time, there was a group of men whose full-time job was to prevent crime and catch criminals. They patrolled the streets, providing a visible deterrent. When a crime was committed, people no longer had to rely on raising the hue and cry. They could call for a constable. The responsibility for law enforcement was transferred from the community to the state. The idea was revolutionary, and it quickly spread. Other cities in Britain and then around the world began to establish their own professional police forces based on the London model. As these forces grew in number and capability, the old system of the hue and cry simply faded into irrelevance. Why would a village raise a chaotic and unreliable mob when they could send for a trained constable? The siren of the police car eventually replaced the shout of the victim. The old laws remained on the books for a long time, like fossils of a bygone era. The legal duty to respond to the hue and cry was not officially abolished in England and Wales until 1827 for felonies and even later for other purposes. But by then, the law was just a historical curiosity. The practice had died out long before. The silence that fell where the cry used to be was the sound of a new world being born. It was a world of specialization, of government services, of a new relationship between the citizen and the state. The individual was no longer legally required to be a part-time police officer. They were a taxpayer who funded a professional service. The decline of the hue and cry was not just the end of a legal custom. It was the end of a world where justice was a hands-on, communal affair, and the beginning of the world we know today. The hue and cry as a formal legal duty is long gone. The sound of an entire village chasing a thief through the fields has fallen silent. But the idea behind it has not completely disappeared. It has left echoes and descendants that still exist in our modern world, sometimes in surprising ways. The most direct legal descendant of the hue and cry is the concept of a citizen's arrest. Most legal systems, including those in the UK and the United States, have laws that allow a private citizen to detain a person they have seen commit a serious crime. This is the last remaining piece of the old duty. It is the idea that a citizen has not just a right, but sometimes a responsibility to step in when the law is broken in front of them. However, it is a pale shadow of its ancestor. The laws governing citizens' arrest are very strict and carry great risks. If you get it wrong, you can be sued for false imprisonment or charged with assault. Unlike the hue and cry, which was a mandatory and collective action, a citizen's arrest today is an individual and highly risky choice. The spirit of community responsibility also lives on in more organized and less chaotic forms. Neighborhood watch programs are a modern version of the old principle. Neighbors agree to look out for each other, to report suspicious activity, and to share information to prevent crime. They don't chase suspects with pitchforks, but they do use phones and email lists to create a network of vigilance. It is a tamer, more structured echo of the Anglo-Saxon tithing, a group of households taking collective responsibility for the safety of their area. But the most powerful and often most dangerous modern parallel to the hue and cry is found online. Social media has created a digital version of the village square. When an accusation is made online, whether it's true or false, it can trigger a digital hue and cry. A post or a video can go viral in minutes. Thousands or even millions of people can join the chase. They share the post, they leave angry comments, they identify the accused, and they bring immense public pressure to bear. This online mob can sometimes achieve a form of justice, bringing attention to wrongdoing that might otherwise have been ignored. It can hold powerful people accountable, but it has all the same dangers as the medieval mob, magnified on a global scale. There is no due process. Mistaken identity is common, with innocent people being wrongly targeted and having their lives ruined. The cry is often based on incomplete or manipulated information. The punishment, a storm of public shaming and harassment, can be brutal and disproportionate. The digital hue and cry is a powerful tool, but it is a chaotic and often unjust one. The hue and cry also teaches us something about our own behavior. It was designed to be the absolute opposite of the bystander effect, the phenomenon where people in a crowd are less likely to help a victim because they assume someone else will. The hue and cry made intervention a legal and social obligation. It forced people to act. Today, without that obligation, we often fall back into the role of the bystander. We see something wrong, and our first instinct might be to film it with our phone rather than to intervene. The world that created the hue and cry is gone. We have professional police forces, a complex legal system, and a different understanding of the relationship between the citizen and the law. We value privacy and individual rights in a way that would have been alien to a medieval villager. We would not tolerate a system that forced us to drop everything and chase a stranger based on a shout. And yet, the fundamental question that the hue and cry tried to answer is still with us. And what is our responsibility to each other? When do we step in? What do we owe our community? The old system was a blunt and often flawed answer to that question. It was born of necessity in a time of immediate local danger. Today, our dangers are different, and our communities are both larger and more fragmented. But the cry for help, in whatever form it takes, still hangs in the air, and we still have to decide whether to run towards it or turn away.